crash landed onto episode 4 of our Tiger Tank all-metal RC build with parts from Heng Long, RC Tank Legion Shop, Motto, Clark, and Taigen Tanks. Hi, my name is Doug. We're going to open up some new parts from Motto. These parts will be going on the top hull of the tank. I could have used some of the parts from some of the older Heng Long tanks that I've had sitting around, but because of the complexity, it just makes sense to buy these parts. You'll probably remember a few episodes back when we put the Taigen hatch covers into place, they did not fit the way we had hoped they would. The hinge point is actually different and the mounting is different. So I wanted to purchase these Motto parts, and later on we'll combine them with the Taigen parts. You'll see later on. These two odd looking parts are the cleaning rods, which were used, they were all put together in a series of 3, 2 on each side, and they were used to clean the cannons. Also hold down the towing cables on the right and left side. And this is the toolbox. You know, this could have been in plastic, but this is the toolbox in metal since all the other stuff is metal as well. We'll have to prime it to make sure we can paint it real well. Well, I promised we'd get back to this pesky speaker enclosure. If you remember, I told you that I was going to put mistakes and successes into this build series, and this was one of my mistakes. I made it actually too large. I wanted to put a larger speaker in, and turns out I'm really not able to do that just because of the depth issues. So I took the box that we did on the previous episode and cut it down on a bandsaw, and then just replaced the panels that were cut away. And as you see, they will fit both the smaller speaker, which is kind of an interesting speaker because it has some weathering capability to it. So if it should happen to get wet, it'll be a little more resistant than the previous speaker that I was going to try out. And there's also room for the smoke attachment. You notice I just took a pen and I drew around the speaker and marked the speaker holes. Now what I'm doing is I'm just trying to find the center of both of these, and I'm putting a little circle around it here. I bought these on eBay a while back. These are diamond tip saws, which do a really nice job of cutting through plastic. Actually, they'll even cut through glass. The only thing that's a little bit difficult about it is it tends to jump around. So you got to be very patient and try to hold it into place with 2 hands because it will jump around and mar your part. So here it is with the section out for the speaker, and I'm just going to take some sandpaper and take away some of the burrs with a number 11 X-Acto blade, and it's pretty close to being able to fit this speaker. This is number 90608 Plastruct. This is styrene tubing that we're going to cut to make a base port for this speaker. Base ports actually help a speaker breathe a little easier. Although you don't have to make one, it does make the box more efficient. I just kind of believe that it gives you a better bass sound with a smaller speaker, especially one that has a pretty decent throw. Bringing out my old miter box, decided to cut these things with the miter box, both sides together. Then I'm using 2 of these to give me a little bit more volume. There is an equation that will determine how long these ports need to be and also the size of your enclosure. The only problem is it's all based on the resonant frequency of the speaker, which is normally never listed. Usually the speaker enclosure will be really large for the speaker that you're using, so you try to get a multiple of it, you know, half wave, quarter wave, at least something that's going to be resonant with your speaker. Truthfully, if you're buying a small speaker or a small radio, the enclosure volume normally is not really followed according to the mathematics. You do need to have an enclosure because the speaker works like an air pump. You got to make sure that air doesn't go from the front to the back, front to the back. You've got to be able to isolate the two. And that's the main idea behind this speaker enclosure. I'll look at it now. It's starting to come together. I have sanded out and cut sections out of this box to make this speaker fit, although I do want it to be kind of a tight fit. I would advise putting your screws in without the speaker being there, just in case your screwdriver pops free. You don't want to pop a hole through your expensive speaker. Here we have Taigen's V2 smoke maker. However, I'm taking a little chance here because Really, the space that I have may be a little bit too tight for this. I'll have to check that out later on. I want to mount it with magnets, and you remember we fiddled around with magnets before on the Feifel air cleaners and the tubes that attach to them. You have to make sure that you have checked the poles and they are all correct. So once you glue your initial 3 magnets, just snap on the other magnets and they will automatically choose the correct poles. Then you're going to want to dab a little bit of glue onto them. Remember, these are the second layer of magnets. First layer have already been glued on. The second layer will be attaching to the enclosure here. This smoke generator is a bit taller than I wish it was. I really may not have enough room to put it in with the metal hull. Remember, that requires a bit more room because of the torsion suspension that takes up some room in the bottom, and then the fastener that holds on the upper hull. It just takes too much room. If the fit is just too tight, I'll end up probably buying a tar smoke unit, and that gives you a constant flow of smoke. One thing I like about the Taigen version, it tends to give you something that looks like a cylinder pump, because it really is cylinders that are pumping this out. Well, the smoker is in, and I'm showing you the 2 ports where it needs to fit with the tubing. Well, let's take a break and do something fun. We'll take this 90875 Plastruct. It is hex-shaped extrusion of styrene, and it's very small, as you see. Look at this extreme close-up. I'm going to cut this with my X-Acto blades, trying to make some very consistent parts, because really sanding these things is very difficult. They're tiny. And what I'm going to do with these little pieces of hex, they're so small, I'm actually wearing my birth control glasses. You know, those headsets that have the magnifying lenses on them? Well, I'm wearing those because trying to make everything work in this small space, it gets hard to see. What I'm doing is I'm using this little section of hex to simulate bolts on the retainers for the hoses that attach, remember, into the manifold and into the Feifel air cleaners. It's just a nice little trick. I actually could drill it out and use some miniature bolts, but there's really no sense at this point. It doesn't really have to hold anything down. And if you start putting these all over where there are bolts located, your model is going to look so much more detailed and realistic as you get close. Take a look. I tend to use this little detail quite a bit, and if you cut off way too many, just keep them in your parts box, because sooner or later you'll need them again. Hey, I want to thank an eagle-eyed viewer that caught one of my mistakes. Let's fix it right now. I had the shovel in the wrong position. So instead of facing to the right, it actually faces to the left. I checked it against some period photographs. He is exactly right. Now, these Motto hatches that I have. Right one is for the driver, left one is for the gunner. And as you notice, we had Taigen hatch covers, which were very nice, but they didn't fit quite right because the hinge points were different and the way you attach them is a little bit different. Right now I'm showing you how these things attach, and man, these things are tiny. I mean really tiny and very difficult to get to. So I used pliers and a screwdriver. Now, notice how the Taigen has much more interior detail that looks a lot like the actual item than the Motto does. So what I'm going to be doing in the next episode, I'm going to pull out the pins and I'm going to swap these parts. We will use the Motto hinge parts, but then the Taigen hatch plate with all of the nice details in there. Purchased one of these, and it took a while to come in the mail, but when it showed up, I did see that it was made of 3D print parts. Now, I own a 3D printer, and I know that there are 2 different kinds of parts. There are good parts and really bad parts. I downloaded the PDF instructions from Clark Electronics' website, and I noticed that the parts in those photographs looked really kind of rough, like a lot of work had to be done on them. When I opened the parts, I was pleasantly surprised. The parts looked like they'd already been cleaned and sanded before I even got to touch them. Before we go any further, let me show you what I'm thinking about for reducing the friction for the turret. I found this 100 millimeter inside diameter Teflon gasket. We'll see how well that works in an upcoming video. So Clark has finally set up some distributorships all over the world. Latest one is here in the USA. And this is what you're going to receive when you order this servo kit. First of all, a very nice little servo from Emax. Almost looks like a little jewel with metal gears. Now here is what I was discussing earlier, the PDF instructions, which really, without any words at all, give you a pretty good idea of how to put this thing together. So let's see how difficult this thing is to build. First part is our main housing, and it looks pretty good. Do you notice what I'm using here for a sanding stick? You can buy expensive sanding sticks at your local hobby shop, or you can just go to a place that sells fingernail files much cheaper. They do a fine job. You'll want to use a bladed tool to remove some of the flash that's on the inside of this housing. And you might want to wear safety glasses. This stuff can fly off and hit you in the eye. I'm serious. Now, as I put the inner piston into this, it really operates pretty roughly. And that is because when you build something in a 3D printer, it's going to have lots of ridges on it. When you're sanding anything that's precision, you don't want to freehand it without any support of your sandpaper. Make sure you use a flat surface on which to sand, because you can control the different bevels and then turn it into a radius. It's a much better way to sand. Now here is one way that I learned how to sand the interior of this. The metal barrel that goes on the cannon works terrifically once you wrap it with some sandpaper, and go back and forth and just continue to work on this because you're going to have to sand that pretty smoothly for that inner piston to be able to work very nice and gently, and that's exactly what you want. Go back in with the knife here. There is some flash on the inner surface that you'll have to get to, but now take a look here. It's actually really smooth, and it'll work just fine. This little gear mechanism is next, and as you see, it needed very little sanding because it was done before it even arrived at my place. 3 screws are all you need to be able to attach it. Now, when you're designing parts for 3D printing, sometimes it can be a little tricky to design a hole that fits a screw really well, especially something that is self-tapping. Well, I gotta say here in this kit, whoever designed this did a terrific job, because these self-tapping screws go in like a dream. They fit just perfectly, and it's not too hard to get them in. As you see here, I'm using a little jeweler's screwdriver, and the screws just go in terrifically. So I'm very impressed. Now on the end, you have to put 2 more screws. This is the stop for the whole mechanism. Not sure why that is added on later on, but that is where you would put a spring if you wanted to. That's what stops the mechanism. Here's a little demonstration of just how smooth a 3D printed part can be. Look at this thing. Goes right back and forth. I am impressed. There's a little bag of RC horns that are included with the kit. The one you want is this round one. And I'm showing you something here that is the trickiest part of building this. The 3D printed part threads perfectly, but the Delrin part that forms the horn is one tough thing to be able to put a screw into. So you might have to use some different screws. Go through little means like this, taking your X-Acto blade, cutting away some of the blushed area on both sides. You just have to keep working at it. At this point, I think I needed to put it down and just take some deep breaths. To make a long story short, just keep working at putting the threads into the tougher plastic part, and then when you screw it all together, make sure you push it very hard with your thumb so the threads take on the Delrin part. Put in your 4 screws and you will be golden, I promise. All right, I think we did well here. Pat yourself on the back for a job well done. At this point, you're going to have to use some common sense and maybe not refer as much to the instructions you got on PDF, because there seem to be several different types of instructions that you can download and a few different kinds of servo mechanisms that are different from each other. This one, once you put the gear on, you'll start to realize that it only meshes one particular way. So this servo fits on the lower section and these screws come in from the bottom. These are a little tougher to go in. So you might have to use a little larger screwdriver. Be patient with these. These screws are real long. But overall, very solid once it gets together. And you're going to have to fiddle a bit with the gearing to make sure that it's right. But that's for a later time when we get further into the construction. But after tightening this big gear into place, it seems like it's going to be a very good operating servo mechanism. And here's one thing that really impressed me. The metal cannon has very, very small threads on it, and it threads perfectly into the piston inside, which seems very difficult to have done. Using the same technique as before, we wrap sandpaper around the barrel and use it to really smooth out the inside of the mantlet. And it can be done. I had a little bit of glue in there from a previous bit of work that I did. So I was able to smooth this thing out, and I think the travel is going to be very nice. But make sure you take a little bit of material out of there because it will scratch off the paint if it's too tight, and that's not going to look as scale. Here is the whole assembly now being fit into the turret, attached to the mantlet. Of course, we're going to have to use a couple of screws and drill through that inner mantlet part to make sure that it's mounted. I'm also planning to put in another servo that takes care of the up and down movement as well as the recoil. If you remember in our last episode, we had a little bit of difficulty when we compared the Taigen and the Mato hatches. The Taigen hatches are beautifully detailed and also have a periscope unit that fits in, but the hinges are of a different geometry and don't fit the Mato upper hull very well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the hinges from the Mato hatches and we're going to trade them out and attach them to the Taigen hatches. And what we do, hope I didn't give you a concussion there. We take out the pins, and the pins will only go in one direction. So if it's tough in one direction, turn it around and hammer out that pin, and it's as simple as that. Then you just put the pin back in with a separate arm. Now I did this with all 4 of the hatches, but I want to spare you that pain. And then here you see we're just attaching now with pliers, and it fastens right back up. Luckily, everything fits well, except for these. These are very tight, these periscope units. I'll have to do some sanding work on these. All right, now I've taken them outside and I have primed them with the SEM or SEM primer, which, as I said in previous episodes, is terrific stuff. So on the right side is the driver's hatch, the left side is the gunner's hatch, and they are very fidgety to put in. I suggest using a magnetic screwdriver. That seems to help, and assist it with some pliers. And just using one washer. That seems to be the way these are mounted in. And I really don't think it's going to be too much of a problem because you still need that movement in these hinges for these hatches to be able to stand upright. Let's try those crazy little periscopes again and see if they fit. Now, they seem to be a good interference fit, but look what happens when I close it. Still too tight. I'll pull that one out and we'll try the other side as well. This close-up shows, that hinge is just a little bit loose, but I think it probably is designed that way. Now, with this hinge, let's see if this periscope unit does any better. It's a tight fit, but when we try to close it, look what happens. Same thing. So I'm going to have to do some sanding and refitting of these, but I think the detail is very, very nice. Next project. Let's put on these tow cables. I bought the tow cables from Taigen. Now these are very easy to make on your own. You can actually use hanging wire that you buy at the grocery store. The tow cables are held down by this single piece, and I like the design of it because it allows this tow cable to be adjusted later on even after it's glued down. It combines the clamps and the poles that are used to clean the cannon. Those are all one assembly there, but I like the part, so that's why I'm using it here. Now the cleats, there are 3 on each side that we'll put in. You could actually do a better job of scratch building these cleats, but I do like the fit of them, and we'll go back in later and put some hex bolt details on them to super detail them. There are 2 different sizes of cleats. The larger ones go up on top with the tow cables, and the smaller ones fit on the side. The wire that Taigen uses for these tow cables is very soft and pliable, but one of the problems is it seems to unwind and it'll kink after it unwinds. So be very careful with it and retighten it. And just don't mess with it a whole lot before you put it down. We'll take care of this side now, just a spot of glue. I'm surprised how well cyanoacrylate seems to attach everything. It holds very firmly even with the SEM primer and the metal. And here in abbreviated fashion, we show attaching the 3 large cleats again to the other side, the tow cable, and they go down real well. But the real nice thing about them is you can move the cable back and forth and make that droop look real natural as you go. Hey, we want you on the tank team. Make sure you subscribe, give us a like, and check out our beautiful new home, our FullEarthWorkshop.com website.